Okay, with the remaining time at our disposal, I will tell you more about how Europeans evaluate democracies. We have seen what they expect from democracy. We have seen initially how the long-term trend of satisfaction, which is a type of evaluation, goes over time, but we have also something more precise to say about how people evaluate democracy in Europe, thanks to the ESS data from the round 6. So what the data gives us here is basically the same scales that we have seen in the world of evaluations, of views. We have them also in the world of evaluations. We have a similar way of constructing these evaluation scales that are identical really to those of the views. The findings, however, are more or less the inverse of what we have seen just before in Hanspeter's part. We have the evaluations of liberal democracy, of social justice, and of direct democracy, which are varying quite a bit from one region to the other. And you can see that in the northwestern part of Europe, citizens are on average much more satisfied in this sense, or evaluate the three components or the three different dimensions of democracy in a much more positive way than this is done by the citizens in Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe. And the differences here are particularly very strong when it comes to social justice, where we have the biggest gap between actually Northwestern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe, where social justice is seen as being particularly badly evaluated. Now, what we can also say is that we have as with the views, a large variation from one country to the other within the region. All right, so here are again the averages on these evaluation scales that you can see for the three different models. And the first thing to note is, however, before we talk about differences between the country, is a huge stability that you can see if you want, or something that is really stable, and that is in Eastern Europe. All of these evaluations in every country are below the European average. So, and I think this is quite an important point to make. There are very few exceptions, most notably when it comes to direct democracy, where we find a number of countries that have above average evaluations of how direct democracy is working, most notably in Slovenia, where apparently Slovenians are very happy with direct democracy. It's also in this dimension that we find the biggest, the starkest contrast between countries. You can see the difference here is 3.1 between the evaluations by Kosovars and the Slovenian citizens' evaluation of direct democracy. Now, how can we explain that? Well, let's turn to participatory theory. Barber, Pateman, etc. have been arguing repeatedly that it is exposure to direct democracy, it is exposure to participatory processes that actually lead citizens to become politically more aware of what is at stake. It leads to higher levels of political competence, and this has also been empirically tested, that this may actually lead to positive effects on feelings of political efficacy and of empowerment by citizens. So we think that it could be simply the fact that you're exposed to real referendums and initiatives that may heighten over time your evaluations of direct democracy. And then empirically it is actually true. I'll show you on the next slide the graphic, but it is true in Eastern Europe for the past 25 years. We have found a strong, significant correlation between the number of referendums held and the evaluations of direct democracy. So really, the broader the experience, the better the evaluation. And we will ask in a second if this is also true beyond the direct democratic model of democracy, if it also applies to experiences with social democracy and with or social justice related democracy type and liberal democracy. Here is the graph, or you can see it's in the paper as well, this relationship between the effective number of direct democratic votes and the evaluations. So when we look at, when we combine this time not the views but the evaluations of democracy with the indices, and here are the World Bank indices of quality of governance, and another type of index coming from the democracy barometer rating. Basically, in all of these cases, we see the very similar pattern. The differences are a little bit between the way the quality of democracy is measured by the World Bank and by the democracy barometer. In one case, you have more of a two-group solution, and the other one, three groups that are seen. So basically, the two concepts, the two indices are clearly related when it comes to liberal democracy, when it comes to social justice, and also when it comes to direct democracy. And you will always find a similar pattern for all of these relationships, as you have in the lower corner on the left, you have Eastern Europe, and depending on which one of the indices you use, it's then joined by Southern European countries. Now, we went on and said this cannot tell us the whole story, these correlations. We need to dig deeper into the data, and we had this theoretical idea of going back to Anderson and Guillory and their groundbreaking work on satisfaction with democracy, showing basically that winning and losing elections matters a great deal in the level of satisfaction that you have for democracy. Basically, the argument is that if you win an election, your probability of liking or being satisfied by how democracy works is higher than if you lose an election. And they show that this is varying from one electoral system to the other. The more consensual it gets, the lower the smaller this difference between winners and losers in terms of satisfaction with democracy. Now, we hypothesized something similar going on, but at the regional level. Basically arguing that the evaluations of democracy are contingent on whether you are winning or losing in elections different from one region to the other. And I'm not going to show you now the regression tables. They're in the paper, but we've run several models showing that basically our results confirm the thesis with regard to liberal and direct democracy in particular, not so much with regard to social democracy, but in the cases of liberal and of direct democracy, clearly electoral winners, people that have won an election, evaluate, I mean the party they've been voting for, evaluate the latter much more positively than losers. So the better one evaluates democracy, in a sense, depends on whether you're in the winning or in the losing camp at elections. The same is true for actually the economy. The better you think that the economy is going, the higher you're evaluating democracy, just as it has been the case with satisfaction with democracy. Now, the conclusions we can draw from that is that basically satisfaction with democracy, as Hanspeter has shown, has a remarkably stable and high level or very stable behavior over time at very high levels in Northwestern Europe and at much lower levels with a downward trend in Eastern and Southern Europe. When we go beyond satisfaction with democracy and we look at the views citizens have of democracy, the expectations, we have seen that with this novel data that is out there, the ESS round 6, we can have a much more refined view on the expectations, dividing the views into a liberal democracy-oriented view and a social democracy-oriented view and a direct democratic model of expectations. And we have seen basically the major takeaway here is that the more developed the democracy is, the lower the expectations. So high levels of expectations are above all found in Eastern and Southern Europe, where our objective measures of democracy are showing that democracy is not doing as well as in Northern Europe. And when we go beyond satisfaction with democracy by looking at evaluations, then we see the inverse. We see that the more developed the democracy, the better the evaluations of citizens, as it can be expected, and therefore lower levels in Eastern and Southern Europe. And what we have seen just a minute ago is that the evaluation of democracy depends a great deal on who wins and on who loses elections. And this is particularly true in Eastern and Southern Europe, where basically whether you have won or lost an election makes a much bigger difference in, and much statistically significant difference whether you evaluate democracy as working or not than it does in Northern and Western Europe. And so this is a rather sobering conclusion, I would say, going rather in a pessimistic direction, because it means that you can still institutionally engineer quite a lot, but it's a little bit similar to the trust measures that Rose and Mischler have come up with, for example. And as long as the citizens think it is the system to be blamed when they lose an election, then they evaluate democracy negatively in these parts of Europe. Thank you.